The officer thought the man at the bar was just another quiet customer. He didn't realize the man was auditing his entire department, and in less than 10 minutes, every police radio in the district would go silent. But before we get into this story, tell me something in the comments. Where are you watching from today? And if you enjoy stories about hidden power, calm people exposing corruption, and authority being quietly held accountable, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes YouTube stops showing these videos, and you might not see us again. Now back to the bar. Because the officer had already made his first mistake, rain tapped against the windows of the old neighborhood bar, like fingers drumming impatiently on glass. Inside, the place smelled like wood polish, cheap whiskey, and the quiet exhaustion of people who had finished long workdays. Most nights, nothing interesting happened here. Truck drivers, local mechanics, 2 nurses who stopped in every Tuesday after their shift, a retired electrician who always ordered the same beer and watched the baseball highlights on the television above the bar. And at the far end of the counter sat a man nobody seemed to notice. He wasn't dressed like money. No expensive watch, no designer coat. Just a gray jacket, worn boots, and a calm posture that looked almost too relaxed for someone sitting alone in a crowded room. He held his drink with both hands, slowly turning the glass as if studying the reflections of the room inside it. The bartender had already pegged him as the quiet type. No trouble, no loud opinions, just someone passing through. But that assumption lasted exactly 8 minutes, because that's when the bar door opened, hard. The sound cut through the room like a cracked whip. Several heads turned. Officer Grant Mallory stepped inside. He carried the kind of presence that made people immediately look away. Tall, broad shoulders, uniform slightly wrinkled from a long shift. The radio on his shoulder buzzed occasionally with distant chatter from dispatch. Mallory had been with the department long enough that most people in the neighborhood knew him, and most of them also knew one other thing. Mallory liked reminding people he was in charge. He walked straight to the bar and dropped onto a stool 3 seats away from the quiet man. "Whiskey," he said. The bartender poured without asking which brand. Mallory grabbed the glass, knocked half of it back, then set it down with a loud clack against the wood. He looked around the room slowly, watching people, waiting for the usual nods, the subtle acknowledgments. People tended to give officers that courtesy, respect, or fear. Sometimes both. But something bothered him. At the far end of the bar, the quiet man hadn't looked up. Not once. Mallory stared at him for a few seconds. Still nothing. The man simply lifted his drink again. Calm, unbothered. Mallory leaned back slightly, tapped the badge pinned to his chest with 2 fingers. The metal made a soft clicking sound. Still no reaction. The bartender noticed and quietly sighed, because he had seen that look on Mallory's face before. The officer leaned sideways toward the quiet man. "You new around here?" Mallory asked. The man turned his head slightly. His expression was neutral, polite. "Just passing through." His voice was calm. Mallory nodded slowly. "Uh-huh." He studied the man more carefully now. "You know something?" The man waited. Most people acknowledge an officer when he walks into a room. The man took a slow sip of his drink, then set the glass down. "I didn't realize that was required." 2 people sitting nearby glanced at each other. Mallory smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "Not required," he said. "Just good manners." The man nodded once. "I'll keep that in mind." Then he turned back toward his drink again. And that's when Mallory's patience evaporated. He slid off his stool and stepped closer. "Let's try something simple," Mallory said. "Show me some ID." The bartender froze. A man at the pool table quietly stopped lining up his shot, because everyone in the room understood what was happening. The quiet man looked up again. "Have I done something wrong, officer?" Mallory shrugged. "Routine check." The man studied him for a moment. Not angry, not nervous, just thoughtful. Is it routine to request identification from someone sitting quietly at a bar? Mallory's voice hardened. It is when I say it is. A few patrons looked away. The bartender rubbed the back of his neck nervously. The quiet man seemed to consider the situation carefully. Then, he reached into his coat pocket. Slowly, he placed a leather wallet on the bar. Mallory grabbed it and flipped it open. He expected to see a driver's license. Instead, he found something else. A black credential card. Minimal text. A small seal stamped into the corner. Mallory frowned. What is this supposed to be? The quiet man didn't answer immediately. He simply folded his hands calmly on the counter. Mallory flipped the card over. The seal looked official, but unfamiliar. What agency is this? Mallory asked. The man replied softly, one that prefers not to draw attention. Mallory snorted. Well, congratulations. You failed. He snapped the wallet shut and tossed it back onto the bar. You don't flash mystery badges at me and expect special treatment. I wasn't expecting any, the man replied. Mallory leaned closer. Step outside. The room grew quieter. The quiet man looked at him. Is there a reason? Mallory's jaw tightened. I don't like repeating myself. The man stood, not reluctantly, not aggressively, just calmly. He picked up his wallet and slipped it back into his coat, then walked toward the door. Mallory followed him outside. The rain had grown heavier. Streetlights reflected across the wet pavement. Mallory crossed his arms. Let's clear something up, he said. You don't walk into my district acting like you're above the law. The man adjusted his coat collar against the rain. I never said I was above anything. Mallory pointed toward the bar. You were disrespectful. The man tilted his head slightly. Disrespectful? Or uninterested? Mallory stepped closer. You're getting real comfortable. The man studied his badge. Officer Mallory. Mallory blinked. How do you know my name? The man didn't answer. Instead, he looked down the street. A black sedan sat parked across the block. Engine running, lights off. Mallory noticed it too. What's that? The man sighed quietly. That, he said, is the reason this conversation is unfortunate. Mallory narrowed his eyes. You running surveillance or something? The man looked back at him. Something like that. Mallory laughed. Well, you're doing it wrong if you're hanging out in bars. The man shook his head slightly. No, it was working exactly as intended. At that moment, the sedan doors opened. Two figures stepped out. They wore dark jackets with small patches on the shoulder, 3 letters. Mallory squinted, then his stomach tightened, because he recognized them. FOD, the Federal Oversight Division. One of the agents approached calmly. He nodded to the quiet man. Sir. Just one word, but it carried a level of respect that made Mallory uneasy. The quiet man nodded back. Agent Ruiz. Mallory stared. You got to be kidding me. Ruiz glanced at him briefly, then looked back at the quiet man. Everything all right? The quiet man considered the question. For the moment, Mallory stepped forward. Hold on. Both men looked at him. You want to explain why federal agents are escorting this guy around my district? Ruiz answered calmly. Because he's the one conducting the audit. Mallory blinked. Audit? The quiet man spoke again. Department Conduct Review. Mallory scoffed. That's internal affairs. The man shook his head. Not this one. Rain continued falling steadily. Mallory crossed his arms again. What kind of review? The man paused, then answered. Regional Corruption Exposure Initiative. Mallory stared at him. I've never heard of that. The quiet man nodded. Most departments haven't. Inside the bar, several patrons had moved closer to the windows, watching, listening. Mallory pointed toward the man. You think you can just walk in here and start accusing officers of corruption? The quiet man shook his head calmly. We're not accusing anyone, Mallory laughed. Sure sounds like it. The man stepped slightly closer. Officer Mallory, do you know how many cities have quietly entered this program in the last 18 months? Mallory said nothing. The man answered anyway. 7. A pause. Tonight might make 8. Mallory's jaw tightened. You're full of it. The man glanced toward the bar door, where silhouettes now watched through the glass. Your department invited us, he said quietly. Mallory froze. That's impossible, Agent Ruiz spoke. The request came from inside the department. Mallory shook his head. No one told me anything about this, the man nodded. That's usually how these things start. Mallory stared at him. Who requested it? The man looked back toward the dark street. A faint red glow reflected off the rain clouds in the distance, emergency lights, approaching. Then he said something that made the moment even heavier. That, he said calmly, is exactly what we're about to find out. Because the approaching vehicles weren't patrol cars. And they weren't local police. They were black SUVs. And the first one turning onto the street carried a passenger whose arrival would make Officer Mallory realize something very important. This wasn't just an audit. It was the beginning of an exposure, and somewhere far above this small neighborhood bar, a corporate network that believed it was invisible had just been notified. The investigation had started. But the real problem wasn't the police department. It was the system behind it. And that system had just realized someone had finally found the first thread. And once someone finds the first thread, the entire structure eventually begins to unravel. Rain thickened into a steady curtain across the street. The black SUVs rolled to a stop one by one, tires hissing against wet asphalt. No sirens, no flashing lights, just quiet arrival. That alone made several officers uneasy, because real operations rarely announce themselves. Doors opened. Men and women stepped out wearing dark jackets, the same small shoulder patch visible under the streetlights. 3 letters, FOD, the Federal Oversight Division. Mallory felt a tightness forming in his chest. This wasn't normal, not for a neighborhood bar, not for a Tuesday night. Agent Ruiz stood beside the quiet man, watching the vehicles with calm familiarity. One of the new arrivals approached, mid-40s, short hair, focused eyes that scanned everything without appearing to. He stopped a few feet from the quiet man. "Sir," he said quietly. The quiet man nodded. "Agent Caldwell." Mallory frowned. "How many of you people are there?" No one answered. The man called Caldwell looked toward Ruiz. "Field confirmation?" Ruiz nodded once. "Initial contact established. Local resistance minimal." Mallory scoffed. "Resistance?" He gestured to himself. "You mean me asking questions?" The quiet man spoke calmly. "Officer Mallory, you're doing exactly what officers are supposed to do." Mallory blinked. That wasn't the response he expected. "Then why does it feel like you're taking over my street?" The quiet man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched another SUV pull up behind the others. Then he said quietly, "Because this street happens to sit on top of a very important data relay." Mallory frowned. "The utility building behind the bar?" Ruiz nodded. "Correct." Mallory looked confused. "That thing handles city fiber lines," Caldwell replied calmly. "Yes." Mallory crossed his arms. "And?" The quiet man finally looked directly at him again. "Your department's digital case archives pass through that relay every night." Mallory shrugged. "Okay." The quiet man continued. "For the last 14 months, someone has been extracting copies." Mallory laughed once. "That's ridiculous." Ruiz stepped closer. "Your department logged multiple unexplained server outages during that period." Mallory's smile faded slightly. "Systems crash." Ruiz nodded. "They do." Then he added quietly, "Unless the outages coincide with encrypted data transfers." Mallory's jaw tightened. You're accusing us of leaking investigations. The quiet man shook his head. No. Mallory blinked. Then what? We're confirming it. That sentence landed heavily in the rain. Mallory stared at him. You've got nothing. But the quiet man didn't argue. Instead, he asked something unexpected. How long have you worked for the department, Officer Mallory? Mallory hesitated. 11 years. The quiet man nodded. That's long enough to remember the Carter case. Mallory frowned. What about it? Ruiz answered. Organized crime investigation, 2 years ago. Mallory's posture stiffened. That case collapsed. Yes, Ruiz said calmly, because key evidence disappeared. Mallory's voice hardened. That was a server failure. The quiet man tilted his head slightly. 3 days after the department upgraded its network security, Mallory didn't respond. Ruiz continued. And 2 weeks after a consulting contract was approved. Mallory looked irritated again. Consulting contracts happen all the time. The quiet man said quietly, especially when they come from Helios Strategic Holdings. Mallory blinked. Helios what? Ruiz studied him carefully. You've never heard that name? Mallory shook his head. No. The quiet man believed him. That was the interesting part. Because Mallory's reaction didn't look rehearsed. It looked genuine, which meant something else. Someone higher up had kept the rank-and-file officers completely in the dark. Mallory pointed toward the SUVs. So you rolled an entire federal task force into my district because of some consulting company? The quiet man answered calmly. Because that consulting company appears in 12 separate corruption investigations across the country. Mallory shook his head slowly. This is insane! Ruiz gestured toward the utility building. We're about to confirm something. Mallory watched as 2 agents moved toward the building door. One of them produced a key card. The lock beeped. The door opened. Mallory turned back toward the quiet man. You didn't even ask permission. The quiet man replied simply, We didn't need it. Mallory scoffed. You think you can just bypass local jurisdiction? The quiet man studied him carefully. Officer Mallory, do you know who signed the authorization for this operation? Mallory shrugged. Some federal judge? The quiet man shook his head. No. Mallory frowned. Then who? The quiet man glanced at Agent Caldwell. Caldwell handed him a thin folder. The quiet man opened it briefly, then handed it to Mallory. Mallory took it reluctantly. His eyes moved across the page, then stopped. His expression changed. Wait. He flipped the page again. No. He looked up. That's not possible. Ruiz spoke quietly. It surprised us, too. Mallory looked back at the document. The authorization signature at the bottom was unmistakable. Chief Raymond Keller. Mallory stared at them. You're telling me the chief requested a federal corruption audit on his own department? The quiet man nodded. Yes. Mallory shook his head. That makes 0 sense. Ruiz replied, It made sense to him. Mallory's voice dropped. When did he sign this? The quiet man answered calmly. 6 months ago. Mallory felt something cold settle in his stomach. Why didn't anyone know about it? The quiet man gave a quiet answer. Because the request included a secrecy clause. Mallory stared. Meaning what? Meaning the investigation remained invisible until we confirmed the leak. Mallory looked toward the utility building again. The agents had disappeared inside. He turned back. You're saying the chief knew someone inside the department was leaking evidence? Ruiz nodded. And he asked us to find out who. Mallory exhaled slowly. That doesn't make him corrupt. No, the quiet man said. It doesn't. Mallory felt a small sense of relief forming. But that relief lasted about 5 seconds, because Agent Caldwell's radio crackled. Caldwell, a voice responded from inside the relay building. Server mirror confirmed. Caldwell's expression hardened. Source? A pause. Then the answer came. Internal police admin credentials. Mallory blinked. That could be anyone. Caldwell asked the next question. Which account? There was another pause, longer this time. Then the voice answered. Caldwell's eyes narrowed slightly. Repeat that. The voice repeated the name. Mallory couldn't hear it clearly, but he saw something change in Caldwell's posture. Ruiz noticed it too. What is it? Caldwell hesitated for a moment. Then he said quietly, You're going to want to hear this. Mallory felt his pulse quicken. Who is it? Caldwell looked toward the quiet man first, then toward Mallory, then back toward the dark street. And finally he said the name. A name that made Officer Mallory feel like the ground had just shifted under his feet. Because the account leaking the department's evidence wasn't some unknown hacker. It wasn't a rogue detective. It wasn't an outside infiltrator. It belonged to someone Mallory had trusted for years, someone with full system access, someone who had just left the precinct less than an hour ago. Chief Raymond Keller. Mallory's voice barely came out. That's not possible. Ruiz spoke quietly. He signed the investigation request. Mallory looked confused. Then why would he leak the evidence? The quiet man's eyes narrowed slightly. That, he said calmly, is the real problem. Because if Keller had requested the investigation, and Keller was also the one leaking the data, then something far more complicated was happening. And somewhere far above the city, inside a quiet boardroom where no windows existed, someone connected to Helios Strategic Holdings had just received a message. The audit had reached the relay point, which meant the investigators were closer than expected. And if the investigators were closer than expected, then the network would have to move sooner than planned, because the one thing organizations like Helios feared most wasn't exposure. It was the moment someone realized the corruption wasn't local. It was systemic, and that realization had just begun. The rain kept falling, steady and relentless, turning the street into a sheet of dull reflections. Officer Mallory stood there, holding the folder, like it might suddenly change its contents. Chief Keller? He repeated. The words sounded wrong, even as he said them. Ruiz didn't rush to explain. Neither did the quiet man. Because sometimes the most revealing moments came when people tried to process the impossible on their own. Mallory shook his head slowly. No, that doesn't track. He pointed toward the relay building where agents had disappeared moments earlier. If Keller was leaking evidence, why the hell would he invite a federal corruption audit? Ruiz folded his arms. That's the exact question we're trying to answer. Mallory looked at the quiet man. You think he's playing both sides? The quiet man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked toward the distant glow of the city skyline through the rain. Then he said quietly, Maybe. Mallory frowned. Maybe? The quiet man continued. Or maybe someone wanted it to look that way. Mallory stared at him. Meaning what? Before the quiet man could answer, Agent Caldwell's radio crackled again. Caldwell. A voice came from inside the relay building. Sir, we got a problem. Caldwell's expression sharpened. What kind of problem? Another pause. Then the voice returned. The data mirror we found. It's still active. Ruiz stepped closer. Define active. It's transmitting. Mallory blinked. Transmitting where? The agent inside the building answered with one word. Outbound. The quiet man's eyes narrowed slightly. That wasn't good. Not good at all. Caldwell spoke into the radio again. Trace it. Several seconds passed. The rain fell harder. Then the response came. We're getting an external endpoint. Ruiz asked quietly. Location? Another pause, longer this time. Then the agent answered. Not local. Mallory shifted his weight impatiently. Where? the voice finally replied. Zurich. The quiet man exchanged a glance with Ruiz. That name alone changed the entire tone of the operation. Mallory looked between them. What's in Zurich? Ruiz answered carefully. Financial infrastructure. Mallory shrugged. So some hacker overseas is siphoning data. The quiet man shook his head slowly. No, Mallory frowned. What do you mean, no? The quiet man stepped closer to him. Because the server receiving the transmission belongs to a corporate holding group. Mallory rolled his eyes. Let me guess. He pointed at Ruiz. Helios. Ruiz nodded once. Yes. Mallory let out a breath. Okay, now I'm really confused. The quiet man looked back toward the relay building. That makes two of us. Mallory stared at him. You said Keller's account was doing the transfers. Yes. And those transfers are going to Helios. Yes. Mallory threw up his hands. So Keller is working for them. The quiet man shook his head again. Maybe. Mallory groaned. You keep saying maybe. The quiet man's voice stayed calm. Because something about this pattern doesn't make sense. Mallory crossed his arms. What pattern? Ruiz answered. The timing. Mallory frowned. Timing of what? Ruiz continued. The transmissions. Mallory waited. Ruiz said quietly, they only happen when certain investigations reach a specific stage. Mallory blinked. What stage? The quiet man answered. Arrest preparation. Mallory felt a chill, meaning right before suspects get picked up. Ruiz nodded. Yes. Mallory's face tightened. So someone's warning criminals before we move. Exactly, Ruiz said. Mallory cursed under his breath. That's not corruption. He looked up. That's sabotage. The quiet man nodded slowly. Yes. Mallory turned back toward the relay building. So Keller is tipping off organized crime. Ruiz said quietly, that would be the obvious explanation. Mallory looked at him. You don't think that's it? The quiet man spoke softly. No. Mallory threw his hands out again. Why not? The quiet man took a slow breath. Because if Keller wanted to sabotage investigations, inviting a federal audit would be the worst possible move. Mallory stopped. That part made sense. Then what the hell is he doing? The quiet man didn't answer, because another thought had just formed, and it wasn't a comfortable one. Ruiz noticed the change in his expression. What is it? The quiet man spoke slowly. Agent Caldwell. Ask them something. Caldwell pressed the radio button. Go ahead. The quiet man gave the question. Ask them if the data leaving the server is encrypted. Caldwell relayed the request. A few seconds passed. Then the reply came. Yes. The quiet man nodded. Of course it is. Mallory frowned. Why does that matter? The quiet man looked at him. Because encrypted transmissions can be two things. Mallory waited. Exfiltration, a pause, or backup. Mallory blinked. Backup? Ruiz's eyes widened slightly. You think Keller is copying evidence? The quiet man nodded. Possibly. Mallory looked stunned. Why would he do that? The quiet man answered quietly. To protect it. Mallory stared. From who? The quiet man didn't respond. Because right then, another vehicle turned onto the street. But this one wasn't an SUV. It was a police cruiser. Mallory recognized it immediately. Dispatch unit. The cruiser stopped hard at the curb. The driver jumped out. Officer Daniels, young, out of breath. He looked around at the federal vehicles in confusion. Then he spotted Mallory. Mallory. Mallory stepped forward. What's going on? Daniels glanced nervously at the agents before speaking. You need to hear this. Mallory frowned. Say it. Daniels lowered his voice. The chief just came through the precinct. Mallory blinked. Wait, what? Daniels nodded. He grabbed something from his office. Ruiz stepped closer. What did he take? Daniels swallowed. The evidence locker key. The street went completely silent. Mallory stared at him. That locker holds case files. Daniels nodded. Major ones. Ruiz looked at the quiet man. That's not good. Mallory turned back to Daniels. Where did he go? Daniels pointed down the highway. He left 10 minutes ago. Mallory looked at the agents. Well? Ruiz already knew what came next, but the quiet man spoke first. Agent Caldwell. Caldwell nodded. Already tracking. He pulled out a small tablet. A blinking dot appeared on the screen. Vehicle telemetry. Mallory leaned closer. That's Keller's SUV? Caldwell nodded. Yes. Mallory squinted at the map. The dot was moving fast, too fast for city streets. Where's he headed? Caldwell zoomed out. The map widened. Highway routes appeared. The blinking dot kept moving north. Then the quiet man saw something. A destination. One location where the highway eventually led. And suddenly, the situation became far more serious. Because that highway didn't lead to another precinct. It didn't lead to City Hall. It led to something else. Something much harder to explain. The quiet man spoke quietly. He's not running. Ruiz frowned. What do you mean? The quiet man pointed at the map. That road goes straight to the airport. Mallory's stomach dropped. You think he's fleeing the country? The quiet man shook his head. No. Ruiz looked confused. Then why go there? The quiet man's voice lowered. Because that airport was flagged during the Chicago audit. Mallory blinked. What audit? The quiet man didn't explain. Instead, he said something far more troubling. That airport's cargo terminal is partially owned by Helios Strategic Holdings. Mallory's eyes widened. You're kidding. Ruiz wasn't smiling. He's taking the evidence there. Mallory felt his pulse spike. Why? The quiet man answered with a quiet certainty. Because whatever Keller copied from those servers was never meant to reach Helios. Ruiz looked back at the blinking dot. You think he's trying to expose them? The quiet man nodded slowly. Yes. Mallory stared down the highway, disappearing into the rain. Then why didn't he tell anyone? The quiet man gave a quiet answer. Because if Helios has people inside the department, he wouldn't know who to trust. Ruiz exhaled. So he's running a one-man exposure operation. Possibly. Mallory looked back at the SUVs. You going after him? The quiet man turned toward Caldwell. Caldwell already understood. He nodded once. Vehicles started, engines humming in the rain. Ruiz looked at Mallory. You coming? Mallory hesitated, just for a second, because nothing about tonight looked like normal police work anymore. But then he grabbed his radio. Yeah. He looked toward the highway. Let's go find out why my chief is driving straight into a Helios facility with half the department's evidence. Because if Keller was telling the truth, then the corruption wasn't inside the police department. It was something bigger, something hidden behind contracts and corporate shells, and somewhere far away. Inside a glass tower in Zurich. A quiet alert had just appeared on a secure screen. The investigators were moving, which meant the timeline had changed, and if the timeline had changed, then someone inside the Meridian network would soon make a decision. A very simple one. Stop the exposure. Before it reached the wrong hands, the convoy moved fast. Black SUVs pulled away from the bar, engines rising into a steady roar as they merged onto the rain-slick street. Tires cut through puddles, sending thin sprays of water across the pavement. Officer Mallory sat in the passenger seat of one of the federal vehicles now. That alone felt strange. An hour ago, he had been a cop finishing a drink after shift. Now he was riding with a federal oversight team chasing his own police chief down a highway. Nothing about the night made sense anymore. Ruiz drove, focused, silent. The quiet man sat in the back seat, watching the tablet in Agent Caldwell's hands as the blinking signal representing Keller's SUV moved north along the highway. Mallory leaned closer to the screen. "How far ahead is he?" Caldwell answered without looking up. 8 minutes. Mallory cursed under his breath. "He's going to reach the airport before we do." The quiet man spoke calmly from the back. "Not necessarily." Mallory turned slightly. "What do you mean?" The quiet man tapped the tablet once. The map zoomed out. Highways spread across the display like glowing veins. Then he pointed to a smaller road. "He'll need to take that exit." Mallory frowned. "Why?" "Because the cargo terminal Helios operates isn't connected to the public side of the airport." Ruiz glanced briefly at the screen. "Private access road." Mallory blinked. "You already knew that." The quiet man didn't deny it. Mallory shook his head. "So this whole thing, you were expecting it?" The quiet man answered quietly. "We were hoping it wouldn't happen." Mallory leaned back. "That's not reassuring." Rain battered the windshield harder now. Lightning flashed somewhere in the distance. Ruiz finally spoke again. "There's something else." Mallory looked over. "What?" Ruiz glanced at the rearview mirror. "At the bar. When we confirmed Keller's account was transmitting data." Mallory nodded. "Yeah," Ruiz continued. "That transmission stopped." Mallory frowned. "So?" The quiet man answered. "That means the server connection closed." Mallory shrugged. "Maybe Keller shut it down." The quiet man shook his head. "No." Mallory frowned. "Then who did?" The quiet man gave a quiet answer. "Whoever was receiving it." Mallory stared at him. "You're saying Helios noticed?" "Yes." Mallory exhaled slowly. "Which means they know we're coming." Ruiz nodded. "Exactly." The SUV sped through the night. Highway signs flashed by in the rain. 5 minutes passed. Then Caldwell pointed at the screen. "There!" The blinking dots slowed. Mallory leaned forward. "That's the exit." Ruiz flicked on the SUV's hidden emergency lights. Red and blue reflections bounced off the wet road as the convoy accelerated. They took the exit hard. The road narrowed immediately. Industrial fencing appeared along both sides. Tall security lights glowed faintly in the distance. Mallory squinted through the rain. "That's the cargo zone." Ruiz nodded. "Yes?" Caldwell looked at the screen again. Keller stopped moving. Mallory's stomach tightened. "Stopped?" "Yes." Ruiz slowed slightly as they approached a large gate ahead. Security barriers blocked the road. A sign hung above them. "Private cargo access, authorized vehicles only." But something was wrong. The gate stood open. Mallory pointed. "That's not normal." Ruiz agreed. "No." The SUVs rolled through. The cargo complex stretched across several acres of concrete and warehouse structures. Massive loading bays, cargo cranes, rows of shipping containers. But the entire place looked strangely empty. Too empty. Mallory scanned the buildings. "Where is everyone?" The quiet man studied the layout. "They cleared the site." Mallory frowned. "For what?" The quiet man didn't answer immediately, because Caldwell suddenly leaned forward. "There," he pointed to the far end of the tarmac. A single vehicle sat under a bright floodlight. Keller's SUV. Mallory felt his pulse spike. "That's him." Ruiz slowed the convoy. The SUVs fanned out carefully across the wide concrete space. Engines idling, agents stepping out. Rain falling hard under the floodlights. Mallory stepped out too. Water immediately soaked his uniform. He walked toward the parked SUV cautiously. "Chief?" No response. Ruiz moved beside him. "Careful." Mallory reached the driver's door. He looked inside. Empty. Mallory frowned. "He's not here." Ruiz checked the passenger side. Also empty. Caldwell approached. "The tracker is still inside the vehicle." Mallory cursed. He ditched the car. The quiet man stepped closer to the SUV. Then he noticed something. The rear door was slightly open. He pulled it wider. Inside sat a metal evidence case. Mallory recognized it instantly. That's from the locker. Ruiz opened it. Stacks of hard drives, evidence storage units, case backups. Mallory's voice lowered. He brought everything. The quiet man studied the contents carefully. Then he noticed a folded piece of paper sitting on top. He picked it up. Ruiz looked at him. "What is it?" The quiet man opened the note. 3 words were written across it. Simple. Clear. "You were right." Mallory blinked. "Right about what?" The quiet man turned the paper over. Another line appeared beneath it. "They're inside the system." Mallory felt a cold wave move through his chest. They? The quiet man didn't answer. Because at that exact moment, every floodlight in the cargo yard shut off. Instant darkness swallowed the entire complex. Agents immediately drew weapons. Lights! But the only illumination now came from the SUV headlights and distant lightning flashes. Mallory turned in a slow circle. "What the hell?" Ruiz spoke sharply. "Power cut!" Caldwell checked his tablet. "We just lost the tracker signal." Mallory's voice rose. "They shut down the network." The quiet man looked toward the far warehouse buildings. Something moved. Just briefly. A shadow crossing the darkness. Then a sound. Engines. Low. Multiple. Mallory spun around. "You hear that?" Ruiz nodded. "Yes." Headlights suddenly appeared in the distance, several vehicles accelerating toward the cargo yard, but these weren't police SUVs. They were black armored trucks. Mallory frowned. "Private security?" The quiet man shook his head slowly. "No!" The trucks got closer, fast. Ruiz narrowed his eyes. "That's not security." Mallory felt his stomach drop. "Then who is it?" The quiet man watched the trucks carefully. Then he gave a quiet answer. "Helios Response Team." Mallory blinked. "You're telling me a corporation just sent a tactical unit?" The quiet man replied calmly. "Yes." Mallory cursed. "That's illegal." Ruiz checked the approaching vehicles. "Not if they're contracted through private international security law." Mallory looked stunned. "You're kidding." The quiet man's voice stayed steady. "No." The armored trucks stopped about 50 yards away. Doors opened. Men stepped out. Black tactical gear, professional posture, no insignias, just clean equipment and coordinated movement. Mallory whispered, "That's not normal security." Ruiz nodded. "Not even close." The quiet man watched them approach slowly. Then he noticed something else, behind the trucks. Another vehicle pulled into the yard, a black sedan, sleek, silent. It stopped near the armed team. The back door opened. Someone stepped out. Tall, immaculate suit. Umbrella held above his head by another man. Mallory stared. "Who is that?" Ruiz squinted through the rain. "Corporate executive, maybe." The quiet man's expression changed slightly, because he recognized the face, not from a police file, from somewhere much higher, somewhere most investigations never reached. He spoke quietly. "That's not Helios." Ruiz looked at him. "What do you mean?" The quiet man's voice lowered. "That man doesn't work for Helios." Mallory frowned. "Then who does he work for?" The quiet man watched the figure walking calmly through the rain toward them. Then he said the name that made Ruiz's eyes widen. "Meridian." The suited man stopped about 20 feet away. His security team formed a quiet perimeter behind him. He looked directly at the quiet man, then smiled slightly. "Well," he said calmly, "that was faster than we expected." Mallory looked between them. "You know this guy?" The quiet man didn't answer. The suited man continued speaking. "You've been very busy lately." The quiet man stepped forward. "Who are you?" The man tilted his head slightly. "I was hoping you'd already know," Mallory whispered. What the hell is Meridian? The suited man looked at him briefly, then back at the quiet man. That, he said calmly, is the question that has caused a great many problems. Lightning flashed across the cargo yard. For a moment, the entire confrontation lit up in white light. Federal agents, private tactical units, a corporate executive standing calmly between them. And somewhere in the darkness of the cargo terminal, Chief Keller was still missing. But what none of them realized yet was that Keller had already done exactly what he came here to do. Because while everyone's attention focused on the confrontation outside, a small encrypted file had just finished uploading to a secure federal archive. And the contents of that file would soon reveal something even more dangerous than corruption. It would reveal proof that the Meridian Network didn't just influence cities. It quietly influenced entire governments. And once that proof surfaced, the quiet war that had been hidden for years would no longer remain hidden. The rain fell harder now, turning the cargo yard into a sheet of dark glass reflecting the few remaining headlights. No one moved. Federal agents stood in a loose formation behind Ruiz and Caldwell. Across from them, the black-clad security team remained perfectly still, disciplined, controlled, the kind of stillness that didn't belong to ordinary corporate guards. Between them stood the man with the umbrella. Calm, almost amused, Mallory's eyes moved from one group to the other. Federal investigators on one side, private tactical operators on the other. And suddenly, he realized something that made his stomach tighten. Neither side looked surprised to see the other. The suited man spoke first. His voice was smooth, measured. "Let's not turn this into something dramatic." Ruiz didn't lower his weapon. "You've already made it dramatic." The man smiled faintly. "I assure you, we didn't intend for tonight to escalate," Mallory whispered under his breath. "You brought armored trucks." The man looked at him briefly. "A precaution?" Mallory scoffed. "Against who?" The man didn't answer him. His attention returned to the quiet man. "You've been difficult to locate." The quiet man stepped forward slightly. "Then, you know who I am?" The man nodded once. "Yes." Ruiz glanced at him. "Care to share with the rest of us?" The suited man spoke calmly. "You're the director of the Federal Oversight Division." Mallory blinked. He turned slowly toward the quiet man. "You're kidding." The quiet man didn't react. The suited man continued. "Which makes your presence here very interesting." Mallory shook his head. "You're telling me the guy I tried to ID at the bar runs the entire investigation unit?" Ruiz answered quietly. "Yes." Mallory rubbed his face with both hands. "Of course he does." The suited man studied the quiet man carefully. "You've been following Helios for a long time," the quiet man replied calmly. "Yes." The man nodded. "But Helios was never the real target." The quiet man didn't respond. The man smiled slightly. "You were looking for us." Ruiz's voice hardened. "Meridian." The man spread his hands slightly. "A name?" Mallory frowned. "A name for what?" The man looked around the cargo yard, then back at Mallory. "For the people who make sure the system continues functioning." Mallory laughed once. "You mean corruption?" The man shook his head. "No." Mallory crossed his arms. "Then explain the evidence leaks." The man tilted his head. "You assume those leaks were meant to protect criminals," Ruiz replied. "They sabotaged investigations." The man smiled again. "Temporarily," Mallory stared. "That doesn't make it better?" The man's voice stayed calm. "It prevented instability." Mallory frowned. "Instability?" The man gestured toward the city skyline, barely visible in the distance. "You think every criminal network exposed simply disappears?" Mallory hesitated. The man continued. "When certain organizations collapse too quickly, something worse fills the vacuum." Ruiz shook his head. "That's not your decision to make." The man's expression softened slightly. but it has been for decades. A long silence followed. Rain hammered against the concrete. The quiet man finally spoke again. You've been manipulating law enforcement investigations. The man nodded. Correct. Mallory stared at him. You're admitting that? The man shrugged slightly. There's no reason not to. Ruiz stepped forward. You think you're untouchable? The man met his eyes. No, a pause. We're simply necessary, Mallory muttered. That's the most arrogant thing I've ever heard. The man turned toward him again. Tell me something, Officer Mallory. Mallory waited. How many violent arrests did your department make last year? Mallory frowned. Hundreds. The man nodded. And how many gangs disappeared after those arrests? Mallory hesitated. None. The man spread his hands. Exactly, Ruiz interrupted. So your solution is to secretly manage criminal activity. The man didn't deny it. Containment? Mallory shook his head. That's insane. The quiet man's voice cut through the rain. Where is Keller? The man looked at him carefully. Chief Keller made a mistake. Ruiz stiffened. What kind of mistake? The man spoke quietly. He decided he wanted to expose us. Mallory's jaw tightened. Good. The man sighed. Yes? A pause. Unfortunately. That forced us to intervene. Ruiz's voice hardened. Where is he? The man gestured toward the warehouses. He's safe. Mallory didn't believe him. You expect us to trust that? The man didn't respond. Instead, he looked directly at the quiet man again. You've been chasing Meridian for years. The quiet man said nothing. The man continued. Chicago. Mallory blinked. Chicago? The man nodded. The airport audit. Ruiz frowned. Seattle. The man smiled. The shipping authority investigation. The quiet man's eyes narrowed. The man tilted his head slightly. You've been close several times, Mallory whispered. Wait, those were all connected? The man nodded. Of course. Ruiz's patience snapped. You infiltrated infrastructure systems across multiple cities. The man corrected him. We stabilized them. Mallory laughed bitterly. By stealing evidence and sabotaging investigations. The man shrugged. Perspective. Then he looked directly at the quiet man again. And now, you're here. The quiet man's voice stayed calm. Yes. The man studied him. Which means Keller succeeded. Mallory frowned. What do you mean? The man nodded toward the evidence case in the SUV. Those drives. Ruiz looked at them. Yes, the man continued. Keller copied something important. The quiet man didn't move. What? The man smiled faintly. A ledger. Mallory frowned. A what? The man's voice lowered. A record of every Meridian operation tied to U.S. infrastructure. Ruiz's eyes widened. That would expose everything. The man nodded. Yes. Mallory stared. Then why are you standing here talking to us? The man sighed slightly. Because the ledger isn't here. Mallory blinked. What? The man gestured toward the SUV. Keller brought the evidence drives as a distraction. The quiet man understood instantly. Keller already transmitted the real file. The man nodded slowly. Yes. Ruiz turned toward Caldwell. Check the Federal Archive. Caldwell was already typing rapidly. The screen refreshed. Then, his eyes widened. Sir. Ruiz looked at him. What? Caldwell turned the tablet. Encrypted upload completed 10 minutes ago. Mallory felt his heart jump. He did it. Ruiz exhaled slowly. That ledger is in federal custody now. The suited man closed his eyes briefly. Not angry, just resigned. Well, he said quietly. That complicates things. Mallory crossed his arms. You're finished. The man looked at him calmly. No. Mallory frowned. What do you mean, no? The man looked back toward the quiet man. You've exposed Meridian. A pause. But you still don't understand it. The quiet man studied him carefully. Explain. The man gave a soft smile. That ledger doesn't just expose our operations. Ruiz frowned. Then what? The man's voice dropped. It exposes the people who authorized them. Mallory blinked. Authorized? The man nodded. Presidents? Ruiz stiffened. Senators. Mallory stared. Defense officials. The quiet man didn't react. The man finished quietly. And several federal oversight committees. The rain continued falling. Mallory whispered, You're lying. The man looked at him. I wish I was. Ruiz turned slowly toward the quiet man. If that ledger is real, the quiet man finished the thought. It will trigger the largest corruption investigation in modern history. The man nodded. Yes. Mallory looked around the cargo yard. So, what happens now? The man opened his umbrella slightly wider. Now? He looked at the quiet man one last time. Now, the real war begins. Lightning flashed across the sky again. For a moment, the entire cargo terminal lit up like daylight. Federal agents, corporate security. A director who had just uncovered a hidden network, and a police officer who realized his quiet night at the bar had accidentally started something much bigger than he ever imagined, because somewhere inside a secure federal archive, a file called Meridian Ledger had just been decrypted, and the first name on that list was someone no one expected. Not a criminal, not a corporate executive, but a sitting United States senator. The quiet man looked toward the city skyline one last time, because he already understood what that meant. This investigation was no longer about corruption. It was about power, and power rarely surrendered quietly. The rain eased slightly, but the tension in the cargo yard did not. Federal agents remained locked in position. Across from them, the Meridian security team stood just as steady. But something had shifted, not physically, psychologically, because everyone standing in that cargo terminal now understood something important. The real confrontation wasn't happening here anymore. It had already moved somewhere else. Inside a secure federal archive server, the Meridian Ledger was being opened, and once it was opened, there would be no putting it back. Officer Mallory rubbed the rain from his face. So, what happens now? He asked again. Ruiz didn't answer. Instead, he looked at the quiet man, because the quiet man was the one who had just started something that might shake the entire federal government. The Meridian representative watched them carefully. He seemed far less worried than Mallory expected. That was the disturbing part. You seem calm, Mallory said to him. The man tilted his head slightly. Should I appear panicked? Mallory gestured toward the agents. You just admitted to manipulating law enforcement across multiple cities. The man corrected him. Stabilizing. Mallory shook his head. You keep saying that. The man shrugged. It happens to be accurate. Ruiz stepped forward. You're about to be arrested. The man looked at him almost sympathetically. On what charge? Ruiz didn't hesitate. Obstruction of justice. The man smiled again. You'd have to prove jurisdiction first. Ruiz's jaw tightened. You operated inside the United States. Yes, the man said calmly. But Meridian itself does not. Mallory frowned. That's nonsense. The man gestured around the cargo terminal. Every company you see here is registered under international infrastructure law. Mallory looked at Ruiz. Now, you can't seriously let him walk. Ruiz didn't respond, because the quiet man spoke first. Let him go. Mallory blinked. What? Ruiz looked back at him too, but the quiet man's expression hadn't changed. The Meridian representative noticed. His smile widened slightly. Practical. The quiet man met his eyes. You've already lost. The man raised an eyebrow. Have we? The quiet man nodded toward Caldwell's tablet. That ledger is already in federal custody. The man exhaled slowly. Yes, Mallory crossed his arms. That's game over. The man looked at him. No, Mallory frowned. Why not? The man's voice softened. Because the moment that ledger becomes public, the consequences will be catastrophic. Ruiz's eyes narrowed. That sounds like a threat. The man shook his head. No. A pause. A warning. The quiet man studied him carefully. Explain. The man nodded. You believe Meridian is a criminal organization, Ruiz said flatly. Correct. The man shook his head again. No. Mallory groaned. Here we go again. The man continued calmly. Meridian was created during the Cold War. Ruiz frowned. For what purpose? The man answered simply. To prevent institutional collapse. Mallory rolled his eyes. That sounds like a conspiracy podcast. But the man didn't look at him. His focus stayed on the quiet man. After several global financial crises, certain governments quietly realized something. The quiet man said nothing. The man continued. Major systems, banks, infrastructure, intelligence networks were too interconnected to fail. Ruiz crossed his arms. So Meridian controls them. The man corrected him. Monitors them. Mallory shook his head. You're splitting hairs. The man's voice remained calm. If multiple criminal syndicates collapse simultaneously, what would happen? Mallory shrugged. Good riddance. The man shook his head. No. A pause. Violence would spike. Power vacuums would appear. Foreign intelligence networks would move in. Ruiz replied sharply. That doesn't justify corruption. The man nodded. You're right. Then he looked at the quiet man again. But that ledger you recovered, a pause, contains the names of people who authorized Meridian operations. Mallory frowned. You already said that. The man nodded. Yes. Then he said quietly, many of them still hold office. Silence fell again. Mallory slowly understood the implication. If that file goes public, Ruiz finished the thought, it could destabilize the government. The man nodded. Exactly. Mallory stared at him. So your plan is blackmail? The man shook his head. No. Then he pointed toward the quiet man. The decision belongs to him. Mallory turned. To him? Ruiz also looked at the quiet man, because they both realized something at the same moment. The director of the Federal Oversight Division now held evidence capable of exposing corruption at the highest levels of government. The quiet man didn't move, didn't speak. The Meridian representative watched him carefully. You spent years searching for Meridian. The quiet man replied calmly. Yes. The man nodded. And now, you found us. Mallory muttered under his breath. Yeah, congratulations. The man continued. But if you expose the ledger, he gestured toward the distant skyline. Everything changes. Ruiz said quietly, maybe it should. The man didn't argue. Perhaps. Then he said something unexpected. Or perhaps that's exactly what someone else wants. The quiet man's eyes narrowed slightly. Someone else? The man nodded. Yes, Mallory frowned. Who? The man smiled faintly. The same people who created Meridian in the first place. Ruiz blinked. Governments? The man shook his head slowly. No. The quiet man spoke quietly. Financial institutions. The man looked impressed. Very good. Mallory stared at them. Wait. What? The man continued. Certain global financial groups would benefit greatly from political instability. Ruiz understood instantly. Market collapses. The man nodded, followed by asset acquisition. Mallory felt his head spinning. So if that ledger comes out, the quiet man finished the thought. The markets crash. The man nodded again. And whoever planned it becomes very wealthy. Mallory looked back toward the evidence case in the SUV. Then Keller didn't just expose Meridian, Ruiz said quietly. He triggered something bigger. The man lowered his umbrella slightly. Exactly. Lightning flashed again. Thunder rolled across the cargo yard. For a moment, the entire place looked frozen in time. The quiet man finally spoke again. When did you realize Keller had the ledger? The man answered honestly. 2 hours ago. Ruiz frowned. And you still came here? The man nodded. Yes. Mallory blinked. Why? The man looked directly at the quiet man. To see what kind of man you were. The quiet man didn't react. The man continued. You now hold the most dangerous file in the world, Mallory whispered. No pressure. The man asked calmly, What will you do with it? The quiet man looked toward the dark sky, rain still falling, city lights glowing in the distance. Then he gave the answer no one expected. I won't release it. Mallory turned instantly. What? Raz stared at him. Director, the quiet man raised one hand slightly. Not yet. The Meridian representative studied him. Interesting. The quiet man continued calmly. Because if Meridian exists, there's a reason. The man nodded slowly. Yes, but that reason needs to be investigated, the quiet man finished. Mallory frowned. You're not letting them off the hook. No. Ruiz understood now. You're expanding the investigation. The quiet man nodded. Yes. The Meridian representative smiled faintly. I suspected you might. Mallory rubbed his temples. So we just walk away. The quiet man looked at the armored trucks, then at the Meridian representative, then back at Ruiz. No. He gestured toward the evidence case. We take the drives. Ruiz nodded. And Keller? The quiet man looked toward the warehouses. Find him. Mallory exhaled slowly. Then what? The quiet man's voice stayed calm. Then we start the real investigation. The Meridian representative watched them carefully. Then he stepped back toward his sedan. Director. The quiet man looked at him. Yes? The man smiled one last time. You just made yourself the most powerful and most dangerous investigator on Earth. The quiet man didn't respond. The man opened the car door, then paused. One more thing. The quiet man waited. The man said quietly, This wasn't the only ledger. Ruiz froze. What? The man looked back at them. There are others. Mallory's stomach dropped. How many? The man gave a small shrug. Enough. Then he stepped into the car. The sedan door closed. The armored trucks began pulling away. Within seconds, the Meridian convoy disappeared into the rain, leaving the cargo yard quiet again. Mallory stared at the empty road. Did that really just happen? Ruiz nodded slowly. Yes. The quiet man looked toward the evidence drives in the SUV, because somewhere inside the Federal Archive system, the Meridian ledger had just revealed the first name on the list, and that name would force the investigation into a place no one expected, the United States Senate. He closed the evidence case carefully, because tonight had started with a simple drink in a neighborhood bar, but it had ended with the discovery of something far bigger, a hidden network, a secret ledger, and a question that would haunt the investigation moving forward. Because corruption doesn't collapse the moment it's exposed. Sometimes, exposure is only the beginning.